It's Friday, 6 p.m., and this is the Annex Suspension Instagram Live. Thank you guys for all joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about suspension tuning on a street car versus a track car.
Yeah, I mean, I really look forward to this topic. It's something that's I think very interesting to a lot of the folks on the team. Um, Quite a few of us, our background is we were into canyon driving and autocrossing and more kind of laid back forms of automotive enthusiasm. And the track stuff kind of came later as we kind of further developed the suspension. So for me personally, I think it's a lot of fun to kind of figure out like what's the best setup for a street driven car versus a track driven car. We've posed a question, over the last week, and we've got some interesting questions here. But yeah, again, we encourage you guys, if you have any questions that pop up like during the stream, please let us know. We'd love to hear what you guys want to know.
That Mopar Wrangle says, I have a question. Don't do that. Ask us a question. We want to find out. And Chase says, Chase in Motion, one of our Annex sponsored drivers who has a S13 who plans to run in Nissan Challenge this year, says, max out the camber and slam it as low as possible.
It's pretty good advice, I think.
All right. So while we wait for some questions, why don't we answer some of the questions that were already asked on our Instagram story? And thank you guys who asked a question ahead of time. Remember, if you want to get your question asked, sometimes this stream goes really fast and we won't be able to answer all your questions. The way you can ensure that your question gets answered is ask us ahead of time in our Instagram story. Chase in Motion says JK. No, come on, man. All right.
I remember him from college days. I think there's more truth to that than he's letting on to.
Victoria, thank you for joining us. Here's
Thanks,
your
Victoria.
oh, hold on. We'll answer. Sorry, Victoria. I guess I gotta interrupt you again. That Mopar Wrangle, I'm wanting to get 20s with plus 18 offset, but I would need to raise my car, but the back end is higher than the front. What's the best lift kit size? So, how do we say this? The type of suspension tuning we do is for a driving enthusiast. So things like airbags, lift kits. People have talked about a cup system before. We actually don't do that. There's probably another company that can better help you out to suit your car's need. But I mean, thank you for your question. So back to the pre-written questions. Victoria Wannabe STI asks, what are some good pointers when looking for suspension for track cars?
Yeah, I mean this one comes up a lot, and I think it comes down to a lot of times when people are looking to make that purchase, they've done research, they know they want to get more involved in motorsport, and there's just a lot of questions about what kind of suspension is going to be best for whatever race series they're in, and this can be it can be hard because like suspension is really subjective, right? Like if you don't know exactly how it's going to feel or how suitable it's going to be to your driving style, because you're just looking at numbers on a spec sheet, and it's really hard to convey what that feels like in real life. For example, I think a lot of us have had the experience where we've driven on different suspension setups that had similar spring rates, and then we find that they actually drive very differently, right? Like some will have really aggressive turn in and really aggressive body control. Others will be more compliant over things like berms, but be a little bit slower on the transitions. And it's really hard to kind of get a feel for, what's going to be best for you without a little bit of experimentation. So when someone's looking for a setup for a track car, I think one thing that helps is kind of getting feedback from other people that have driven on the various setups. It's a little bit harder if you're evaluating a suspension setup or suspension product where the valving is not consistent, because some things can be very aggressive or stiff on one application, but if the product line is not consistent across applications, it could feel very different. So it's usually better to find and to get advice from someone that's driven that that product on the same application. But some of the other companies out there will try to keep the valving a little more consistent across applications, so that's helpful. And when you're looking for a setup for a dedicated track car, I think another thing that's important to keep in mind is what kind of tires will you be running. Will you be, or do your points allow to have, aero? How aggressive and how far can you go with the modifications in your class? Because that also will help to determine what kind of suspension product that you're looking for. And for us, when we are helping someone decide if they want to go towards more towards a track direction, or if they want to mainly just drive on canyon roads, or drive to the office, it's important to kind of get that feedback from people to see what's going to be the best setup for them. And I think if you're building a track setup, it's really important to see what kind of spring rates are going to be best matched for the tires that you're after. Do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
I want to say Rocky Z just joined us, and Rocky has our Fast Road Pro application on his FC RX-7. For you guys just joining us now, we are doing a topic on suspension tuning, street car versus track car on this Instagram Live. One thing I wanted to add for you about getting opinions from other people with the same chassis. I think we talked about this before. It's tough because there's feelings like comfort, handles well, is it stiff? That's all subjective stuff,
Right.
which is going to be different for every single driver, right? Or every single owner of a particular chassis. And the biggest one that comes to mind is we have a Fast Road Pro for E36 M3, and you guys can see that video on YouTube. France has that E36 M3 been through like 10 different setups before he finally settled on Annex. And talking with him in person, one thing he said was like, yeah, everyone on the like big names on the forums would say like, this is the way to go. This is the way to go. This doesn't make noise. But ended up all of them did not suit his needs, or, either some made noise, some were less like comfortable than he desired.
What he was looking for didn't jive with what other people were looking for in the forum, right? And you can't really have that detailed conversation unless you're with someone in person or you're riding in the car. So, it kind of makes it difficult.
Yeah, exactly. Victoria had another question, which is okay. More than one question is okay on this. What would be the main difference between street suspension versus track suspension?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good question there. The most obvious thing is going to be the spring rates. Typically if you see, let's say for an S2000 as an example, that car has a really high motion ratio, so it's not uncommon for a street spring rate to be something like 12K in the front, maybe 10K in the rear. Our own Fast Road Pro application for the S2000 has a 12K front spring rate and a 9K rear spring rate. And for those of you that have been tuning in for a while, you know that we bring up motion ratios and sprung and unsprung weights a lot, but it's another kind of layer that makes it difficult to figure out what's going to be good for street or track. Because if someone talks about a 12K spring rate, that sounds like it's really high. That spring rate on an older car or a car with struts that isn't very light would be really, really high. And you can't just go off the spring rates alone when trying to figure out if the suspension is going to be stiff or soft. What you can do though is you can get a feel for what the spring rate's going to feel like in that car if you know a buddy that has a certain spring rate set up, and you can pay attention to certain things like how much does the car move when it's hitting a bump or a large undulation on the freeway, and that can kind of give you a sense of how firm the what we call the natural frequency is, or how high the natural frequency is, to see what is the effective spring rate of that platform. Now, that is a bit of a generalization, because when you have different types of valving, something can feel stiffer than it actually is in real life. But that is one way to kind of get a feel for what's going to be a good street or a track setup, is by kind of valuing what it feels like on another vehicle. So for us, when we're building our street product versus our track product, so our street product would be Fast Road Pro, and then our more track oriented product is called Club Spec Pro. And just a recap for you guys that are maybe not as familiar with the brand or the live stream, but we have two products. We have Fast Road Pro, which is designed for people that are driving in the canyons. They're enjoying their cars on the weekends. They may want to have people ride in the car with them and kind of need the car to be like a more of a usable car, more not something that's like gutted out and for track only. We came out with that product first, and then we had a lot of requests from our customers saying that they wanted us to do a more track-oriented product. So we worked with a local racing group called 86 Drive Challenge, and we developed a product called Club Spec Pro, which is meant for club racers, like the drivers that are in that series, in this club racing series. And through that process, we developed different types of valving profiles that are better suited for street or for track. And internally speaking, one of the major differences on the valving is we will focus more on having more low-speed damping control with our track-oriented product, and less of it on the street product. And one might think that, like, if you have less spring rate or less valving in a particular area, that's going to mean less performance. But it turns out, based on the types of roads that you're driving on, it can actually be a benefit to have less valving in a certain direction. So, for example, when I talk about having less low speed damping, when I talk about low speed damping, I'm talking about the shock speed and how fast that shock is moving. So, if we're talking about body roll and how the car is transitioning, that shock absorber is moving a little bit slower than it would be if you hit a large bump. So when we have less low speed damping, that's allowing the car to move a little bit over bumps that are found on real world roads. And if you can let the suspension builder know what kinds of surfaces you're going to be traveling on, we can figure out the best valving for a certain car on a type of road surface. There's probably more I can add to that, but when we take a break on that.
Oinjo just joined us. Is it hot in here, or I'm just anticipating his questions? And for you guys just joining us now, we're doing an Instagram live on suspension tuning, street car versus track car. DC5 Twisties, thank you for joining us again on the live.
Ooh,
we have a question from DC5 Twisties. What's the difference from having a longer spring versus a shorter spring on a coilover? Do they still perform the same even though they are different lengths?
Performance is relative to how it's going to be used. So a longer spring in general will allow you to get more stroke out of that spring. If you can imagine, like, for a certain height of a spring, you've got so much free space between the coils, and the more free space you have means the more that spring can compress until it either coil binds, which is the worst case scenario, or you get up to its usable range before the spring takes a permanent spring rate loss because it's been over compressed. And the general rule of thumb is you want to use as short of a spring as you can, as long as you have enough stroke built into the shock absorber and on the spring design, where you're not over-utilizing that spring. Because let's say if you have a shock that moves this much, but you put as long of a spring as you can fit on there, and the spring can maybe have this much stroke on it, then yeah, you can handle that shock stroke, but you're actually adding more weight than is necessary. So if you're racing and where weight matters, then you want to use as short of a spring as you can within the operating range of the spring. And most good spring companies will have that information published, so you can actually see what is the usable stroke. And if you're building like a homebrew setup, you can go look that up and see how much is the usable stroke, and then come and actually measure that on the shock absorber that you're using to see what the shock is capable of. The other things to keep in mind are you also have the bump stop height, how much it compresses, and how much room you have for the wheel to actually travel in the wheel well. And those are two other areas that you can use to figure that out. But in short, you just want to use as small of a spring as you can.
We have a lot of questions. So Soul Search asks, how is the testing going for Golden Era Hondas? Any info on spring rates so far? And Victoria just wants to say Rob is missing out. So Destiny the S2K, because Rob's at Thunderhill right now.
Oh, wow. At least it's for a good cause.
And then Rocky says, Golden Era Honda, like 2006 Honda Accord? Yeah. And Victoria also says, I wonder what the Golden Era in Honda is. Lol, because they're all pretty golden. I wouldn't say that. There was a time when Honda was rebranding Isuzu, so I wouldn't say era Honda is golden. But let's answer Soul Research's question. How is testing going for golden era Hondas? Any info on spring rates so far?
So I think this is probably in reference to our latest post where Jeff Wolfson on the team has been building a suspension setup, a Club Spec Pro setup for his own EG6 Honda hatch, and I think it has a B18 and like a Integra Type R transmission with tighter gearing. I think Integra Type R axles. It's a pretty cool car that he picked up, and he's looking to do some more serious racing with it. So I think I can speak for Ezekiel and myself. Most of our experience has been with rear-wheel drive cars, and most of our tuning experience has been with rear-wheel drive cars. We dabbled with some all-wheel drive stuff earlier in the year, and that was quite interesting. And except for one person on the team, Mr. Colgate, who raced or who autocrossed the Honda Fit at a really high level in some regional autocross series. For the most part, we don't have very much experience with front wheel drive, so that has been a totally new world and an interesting new challenge for us to go and take a look at. I want to say though that after the first pass, the results have been really good. I got to test drive Jeff's car not too long ago, and yeah, it's definitely a different driving experience. I got to drive it when it was stock with let's just say a more old school way of doing suspension on the cars. You know, where we had a sleeve on top of a drop in shock insert, and you know that felt good for what it was. I think in a lot of ways, I think the Honda guys were actually ahead of how other tuners have been modifying their cars because they were using at least decent shock inserts. So on that car as it came in here, it actually felt decent. It was just the spring rates were pretty low, and so we did our normal work that we do on the R&D vehicle that comes into the building. We got its corner weights. We measured the motion ratios on the car. We looked to see if there's anything modified on the suspension that could change the results. In this case, the suspension was totally stock except for some different springs and shocks, and we found some pretty surprising things. I think Jeff was a little bit disappointed. We found that the car was almost 2,400 pounds in a mostly stripped EG with a roll bar in the back. And this could be with him in it. I forget the details on that, but it was definitely heavier than we were expecting. And we found that there was a lot of weight on the front wheels, like a lot more than I had expected. I think we saw something like 700 pounds on the front wheels versus like 400 or 350 pounds on the rear. So that weight distribution is pretty staggering compared to what we normally deal with. The last time we had a front-wheel drive car in here, I think, was Rob's FA Civic, and that was not as extreme as this. I remember, and so we kind of took the math of that car and we put it into our calculator, and it gave us some spring rate results that were pretty surprising, actually. For the frequencies that we decided to go for the types of tires that Jeff was going to be running, it was suggesting that we use like a 17 kilogram spring in the front and only a 7 or 8 kilogram spring in the rear. And I thought that's really unusual. That's a huge stagger between the front and rear. Very unusual for what we see here. And I checked with Jeff, and sure enough, that is a pretty unusual setup. Usually people will try to have a pretty high rear spring rate on these Hondas to get it to rotate. But what we saw in the math was that the frequency split front to rear, or how stiff the effective spring rate was front to rear, was really saying that we should just keep going with that path. So we went ahead and built up some shocks for that Civic, and I think we settled on a 15K in the front and a 7K in the rear. And then Jeff found a nice large rear sway bar with an adjustable blade, so he can really add in a lot of roll bar strength to get the car to rotate. And he went out to Buttonwillow this last weekend. And he did great. The car was keeping up with spec Miatas. It looked unflappable over the bumps. It did not feel like it was overly pitchy, to the point where we felt like we could actually go higher spring rate in the future. Just because the spring rate balance was working well, and the dampers were working well with that spring rate. So yeah, in a nutshell, like that car was a blast to develop for, and it's always fun for us to do a new application. And I'm really looking forward to doing more front wheel drive or Honda applications, because it's definitely an interesting challenge, and it was a lot of fun.
Rolt831 asks, valving setup for drift or is it all hype? I assume he's asking if there's like a specific valving setup you have for a drift car, which I'm
Yeah,
I'm curious about too.
yeah. Yeah, so it's funny. So one of the guys on our team definitely has some experience with drifting, and uh, and I had a little bit of experience helping a friend that was becoming a pro at the time as well, and so we looked into it a little bit back then. But there are definitely some valving nuances or changes that you want to do on a drift car. The whole goal of a high level drift car is not to force oversteer, but actually to be able to put down as much power as you can to the back wheels. So without going into a whole another can of worms, in general, you're just trying to get the car to squat and hook up as much as you can as a rear, and then use that 1,000 or whatever it is horsepower these days, allow the car to just power through to force the oversteer to induce it. But by maximizing the amount of rear traction you have from the rear tires, you're able to get as much cornering and corner exit speed out. And the goal is to use that extra grip to make more smoke and utilize as much of that power as you can, and also to get the car to hook up and hopefully lose your competitor in the dust if you can out accelerate and create a gap, which I think the judges like to see.
Soul Research says, thank you for the thorough answer. And he gives the Shaka sign. I hope they are ready for 2021. I'll be competing in Honda Challenge on the East Coast.
Oh, dude, can't wait.
Soul Research, shoot us a DM. What chassis do you have? Because that'll depend. If you're going to compete, we'd like to make an application for your chassis. So shoot us a DM after this. What chassis do you guys have?
Yeah, I actually want to add a little more into that. Yeah, if any of you guys have like EG or EK Civics and you're looking to compete, in some kind of a sanctioned race series, we definitely want to hear from you. We're looking to work with more drivers that are getting serious about road racing. So yeah, please reach out if you have a car or you have a friend that's campaigning a car of that generation.
Red X Joey asked the difference between Fast Road Pro and Club Spec. So I know, Joey, you have a Corolla and a FRS. So what I would recommend, we did an hour-long product showcase on the 886 chassis. So I'd go on our YouTube channel and that'll answer a majority of your questions. If you still have any more questions after watching that hour-long video, please shoot us a DM or shoot us an email. Thanks, Joey. All right. Rocky asked, there was a question about assist spring rates as well. And I was hoping to dodge that question because it's from our best friend Owinjo. But I guess if someone's going to bring it up.
What's assist spring rates?
So Owinjo asked previously, how you know when to pick the right assist spring rate. So I have a small aside to tell you and the audience. Do you know what story I'm going to tell?
No.
The SEMA story. We went to SEMA last year, and we just, besides just generally having fun at SEMA, we walked around and like looked at other what else was going on in the suspension market. And there was one particular company that was overly passionate about their product, which was cool to see, but also kind of concerning at the same time because there was like basic like lexicon like helper versus assist spring. Like they were really adamant about it. I thought you guys were going to get in a fist fight over like just the terminology. And then same thing, like if a helper spring, helper is another one. If a helper spring is supposed to add to the spring rate, I thought he was going to like tear his shirt off and fight you after that one.
Yeah. We were just talking with some vendors about picking up some different, helper or assist springs for a racing product. But yeah, I guess the lexicon was really important to these guys. And, I get it, right? Like they're super, super into what they do, the craft that they do, right? They exclusively develop springs. That's all they think about. So I guess in a lot of ways they're even more niche than we are, right? And I thought we're a pretty niche company as well. But yeah, so I totally get that. For us, like we do see some performance differences by Well, I'm not gonna say we see a whole lot, but we do see some performance differences with the types of helper or assist springs that we use. But for us, a lot of it comes down to packaging, because we focus on the bump stop engagement as a priority to maximize the stroke. We'll often pick a helper spring that has a rate that we're looking for, or we'll have the packaging requirements that we're looking for to allow us to get as much possible shock stroke into the application as we can.
Wannabe STI says, wishing there was a Subaru competition event.
Oh yeah, me too.
So do I.
Isn't that Global Time Attack?
There's, I, I was shocked to see the amount of Subarus at Global Time Attack. Just because out in the Bay Area, it's rare to see a Subaru at a HPDE.
Oh yeah,
but
yeah.
and I was like, how many are we gonna see? And like all the like
Yeah, most of the field, right?
was Subaru.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Let's see. So for you guys just joining us, we are doing a Instagram live, and the topic today is suspension tuning, street car versus track car. Burstcraft, who is our neighbor in Fremont, California, asks, are there certain supporting mods that are more prevalent on either discipline versus the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I again, I really like this topic quite a bit. It's for us, it's really fun to build a suspension that's best suited for a given application. So, for example, like we really enjoy setting up race cars and competing, and we also really enjoy setting up cars using Fast Road Pro that are just driving for fun, right? And if your main focus is going through the canyons and just having a good time with the car, maybe going to some track days every now and then, but you're not competing for times necessarily. You can really make a car that's very usable, has enough stroke to handle like real world roads, and can just be a blast to drive without being tiring on the driver, which I think is a big thing that people don't really consider when they're choosing a suspension setup. So if for like I think or I'll speak for myself, my ideal setup for a car that's driven in the canyons and is also used to go get groceries or to pick up friends and family from the airport. I really like a setup where the spring rate is firm, where you've got that body control, but you've got the valving set up so that it's blowing off when you're hitting sharp impacts like freeway gaps in the road or potholes. But you've got the spring rate there when you need it, when you're really trying to lean into the car. But there's always going to be trade-offs. If you have a street-driven car, you're probably going to be having a more street-focused tire for quite a few reasons. One major reason for using a street tire is it's safer in the rain, right? Like I think some of us can remember those times where we got that awesome new tire that was really hot at the autocross, and we went on our first drive in the rain, and like, holy crap, it's scary. It's really scary, And I think as we kind of mature as driving enthusiasts, we kind of know it's better to pick something a little more well-rounded. So now I get a little more excited about a tire that hooks up well in the wet and in the dry, and isn't overly harsh to drive with. So if we're picking a tire like that, they're typically tires in the 260 to 330 tread wear range, something around that, in that ballpark. It's good to pair that kind of tire with modifications that really, how do you say it, support that tire rather than take away from it. And what do I mean by that? If you have a tire that isn't as grippy as a race tire, you're going to want to run softer spring rates to get the most out of that tire, because you're letting it hook up rather than overpowering the tire. But also you might just want to run softer spring rates on the street because it's more comfortable, at the end of the day. So because of that, it's more important to have a good sway bar package that will kind of pick up where the spring rates start to focus more on having compliance on the road rather than outright body control. So if it's a street-driven car, we'll usually get someone to get some upgraded sway bars, as well as with the Fast Road Pro product, to kind of get the best of both worlds. And another thing is, what kind of bushings are going to be used on the vehicle. I think a lot of people that are driving on the street are perfectly happy with OEM bushings, or even polyurethane bushings can be a really good pair for when you're using a street-driven car. And I think those are probably the primary areas you want to focus on if you're building a car for canyon driving versus outright race driving. And we can definitely talk more about the race setup, but let's see if we have some more questions.
Yeah. Actually, Mitch, we had on the phone yesterday, zc6.brz. How's it going, guys?
How's it going?
When will this podcast be uploaded to YouTube? I missed the first half. Sad face. So every Monday, the podcast gets released on video on YouTube, and then audio only Annex Suspension podcast, and then Annex Suspension group on YouTube. Tyler from the R&D team just joined us. Hello, Tyler. Frying Solo, who also has a Subaru, who we met at Global Time Attack. Thank you for joining us. She says, "Boo, slicks for life." And you spelled life wrong. LYFE. Wannabe STI. Oh, Jonathan Wong, JYSF joined us. And Jonathan has a E46 M3. I know we've been getting a lot of requests for E46 also.
Yeah, definitely.
Unfortunately, it seems like every single type of E46 takes a different suspension. So if we're right, if we're wrong, let us know. Rolt831 asks another question, which also relates to another Capatronic Carlos P. No. Rolt, who and Stephen Van, our very own shipping manager at Battle Garage RS here in the Bay Area. So Stephen asks, opinions and advantages on inverted shaft / strut, and that is similar to Rolt's question. Is there any reason why high-end brands steer away from inverted monotube? Seems most, if all, high-end brands go with twin tube or monotube.
Well, I think that's a good question, and we're mixing terminology a little bit. Twin tube and monotube is more about how the fluid and the air pressure or nitrogen pressure is separated inside the shock. But yeah, I mean, that's a good point. We do see a lot of suspension setups that have an inverted, setup or just a more traditional monotube, like ours as well. And I think they have some, pros and cons. If for us when we're going to the track or we're even just using the suspension on the roads, one thing that we pay attention to is how much friction that the shock absorber has, and if you have a thinner main shaft, you can use a smaller seal, which keeps the oil inside the shock, and that allows you to have less friction when the shock is operating. And you can really feel this if you have a shock absorber that is really low in friction, like a Penske or something, where the tolerances are really loose to try to let the shock move as freely as possible. You can kind of feel how the wheel can more easily track with the road surface. But there's downsides. If you have a really loose tolerance shock, it needs to be rebuilt more often because you've got dirt going in and you've got oil coming out. And so that's why it's more common to see a race suspension that needs to be serviced more because it's designed for a season of racing. And so if you have a larger shock shaft like you do on the inverted monotube, you've got more seal surface area, and so that can build up more friction as well. That being said, if you're using that shock in a really, really abusive and a really aggressive environment, like let's say rally or rallycross, where you're jumping cars and landing on berms and are really putting a lot of loads on it, inverted monotube can also be better suited for that because of the durability of that larger shock shaft. So it's kind of like, what are you looking for out of the suspension, and then you can kind of pick which type is best for your needs.
Victoria asks, will softening the suspension help with daily? Asking because I daily the FA5 now, lol. So Annex did a R&D on the FA5 chassis Civic. And so how would you answer that question? That's Rob's old Civic, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That was the first front-wheel drive Honda that we did, and that was a blast. That car's got let's just say more power than it did when it was stock. So that thing was a riot. And thanks again, you guys, for trusting us with that car while we worked on it. And So one thing I'm going to define is like when someone says softening the suspension, we kind of see that in two ways. It's, are we softening the valving or are we softening the spring rates? And based on this particular question, I think Victoria is talking about the actual damping. And yeah, I mean, the main area on our shocks where you're going to see the biggest difference when you adjust that bleed or that adjuster on the shock absorber is the low speed damping is going to change the most. There will also be some high speed damping changes as well, but the majority of it's going to be in the low speed. And again, low speed is what controls body control. So if you're at the track, you want to have a tighter bleed so you can get the car to transition, faster. Good examples, if you guys have been to Button Willows, there's that part of the track called Cotton Corners where you've got a succession of switchbacks, back and forth. And if you can get a car that can rotate quickly there and change direction, you can definitely shed some time. But there's drawbacks when you have that much low speed body control. How do you feel this? It could be as simple as going over a speed bump just on your normal, day-to-day, route that you're going on. If you have very tight body control at low speed, you're going to feel that speed bump. The spring can't really move that much, and the shock is really taking control of the situation. And so, yes, you can definitely use our adjusters to kind of soften it up so you can get a better ride compliance to your day-to-day activities. And then you would just want to tighten it up when you start to drive more aggressively or drive at the track.
Jonathan Wong with the E46 M3 says, "Can't wait for the E46 application." Neither can I, Jonathan, but I also don't want to R&D 5 different of the same chassis. Because apparently, from what I hear, M3, sedan, coupe, hatch, wagon all take a different suspension. So as much as I would love to do E46, I think it's a cool car, I don't want to do 5 of them.
Please tell us if we're wrong. I have not looked into this myself, but Ezekiel feels very strongly that it's E46s are going to be a nightmare. But I will say that we have gotten plenty of requests for the E46 M3 and also the base E46. So, if we do see a common trend there, like E46 coupes, there seems to be some demand, then we can definitely pick up that one. But yeah, if they're all different applications, as you guys know, we do R&D in-house and we measure every vehicle, and may not be worth it for us to do 6 different types of the same car.
Jonathan says you just need to worry about the M3, which may be the case, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my God. And I said, oh my God, because X Lazy says, will you guys be building suspension for the DC5 chassis? I'll tell you my opinion on this. It's really tough to gauge when we do R&D, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, a lot of manpower. So we really got to make sure, as a company, like every company needs to be profitable. So if we do R&D on this application, we're essentially betting a lot on this application is going to sell. Mm-hmm. I realize almost every single live stream we get at least 1 or 2 people like, do you make DC5? But it's tough to say, right? Like the Honda market is so saturated. Yeah. Does someone want our level of product and is willing to pay that level of price? That's what I don't know, right? So again, like DC5, I'm stumbling because it's Integra, but it's really RSX out here. DC5 is a really cool chassis, but like the suspension is like terrible on that thing, just like the EP3 Civic. So like that's a R&D hurdle as well as potentially a sales hurdle. We could make the best DC5 product out there, but no one would buy it. You take that gamble every single time with R&D.
Ezekiel's making some really good points about the practicality of us taking on the application, but I, for one, am hoping to be proven wrong. I'm hoping that that there's more and more Honda and Acura enthusiasts that are looking for a higher grade of product that will reach out to us and say that, hey, we're serious. We like your product and we want something for our cars.
Mitch ZC6BRZ says 330i because that's what they use in spec E46.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Why don't we attend a spec E46 event?
Oh yeah, that'd be cool.
Then like see how big it is? Because if it's huge, then that would make sense to do a 330 Ci, right?
Yeah, but then we'd have to be the spec suspension though, right?
Oh,
we can make it, but they don't
can't
use
win.
it.
Can never win. Victoria has a bunch of things to say. She says, yes, E46 all have different suspensions. So sad, lol.
Oh, man.
And And then she made fun of me. She put in quotes, "Oh my God, Ezekiel." Tyler says, "It's really complex suspension. It's going to be almost as hard as R&D on a BMW, lol." And Burstcraft just joined us.
Oh man,
Yeah.
probably could have chimed in on that.
Burstcraft, you'll have at least one DC5 willing to test run. Okay, we'll keep thinking about it, Burstcraft. I know you're down the street from. Yeah, I know you're down the street from us in Fremont, California. So yeah, we'll keep thinking about it. In the meantime, let's get back to some more of these questions answered ahead of time, and we are at almost our 15-minute mark. So if you guys have a question, make sure to get them answered on the live, or they'll never be answered again. Capatronic Carlos P says, "Streetcar with track coilovers? ? Good or bad idea?"
I think that depends on who you ask. We've met plenty of people in the local race series that they are so hardcore about their track cars and their track driving that they genuinely prefer to have a track suspension on their daily drivers. I'm not in that category. We have Club Spec Pro on my FRS right now, and I'm looking forward to putting our updated Fast Road Pro product back on it. And that's because I like to use my car as a car. And really high spring rates are not conducive to me drinking my coffee on my way to work every day. But that being said, like, it really depends on what you're looking for. Some of these guys that I'm mentioning, they love driving, right? They'll go every weekend. They'll just look for like canyon roads on the way back home, like anything they can to get scratch that itch. And we love them for that. And for them, a truly dedicated track suspension might be what's the most enjoyable for them. And you can have some compromises too, right? You can still have a more track-oriented valving, but use a little bit softer spring rate. Or you could have a more track-oriented spring rate, but use a little bit softer low-speed, valving. So there's different ways you can make it work, and it's always fun if you're able to work with a shock person that can kind of tailor to what your needs and what you're looking for.
Egg Wardo asked us a question in our Instagram live that I constantly get this question. I probably get this question 3 times a week. How do the Swift springs compare to the standard springs? So when I answer customer inquiries, I think the most common is, are the Swift spring upgrades worth it, and what's better about them? I answer that question like 3 times a week.
Yeah, it's a really good question because without having experienced both, or being more kind of in the industry, it's hard to know exactly what that means and what you're getting out of it. Basically, the way we advise folks is, if you have a street driven car and you're not competing for times, a lot of times just the conventional springs will work out just fine. Some of the advantages that you get with Swifts or other higher end springs, but I think Swifts in particular, because they have a pretty unique material that they use to make the springs, and you can kind of physically see this when you compare one spring rate, one Swift spring with another spring that's the same dimensions otherwise in terms of spring rate and height. But the spring will be lighter, and the Swift spring will be lighter, and it'll also have more stroke. Sorry, I'm blanking on the term right now, but more stroke ability on that spring, so you can get more usable stroke out of it. And also has a little bit less tendency to sag over time. So also they look amazing. That's probably one of our favorite parts about it. But so it kind of depends. Like, if you have the extra budget to go with the Swifts, we definitely recommend it. Or if you still want to step into a higher level of suspension, but don't quite have the extra scratch, conventional springs can work out really well as well. I don't think you are going to regret getting normal springs instead of Swifts. At the end of the day, it's kind of more like, what does your budget allow for, and what are your criteria for a street product? For racing, since time is of the essence, and usually people's budgets are a little bit higher for racing, all of our race products have Swifts on them, so you don't need to decide on that one. It just comes with it.
I Schultze says the RX-8 looks like a giant grasshopper, and Rocky says you're not wrong. And
where did that come from? Why is this happening?
Because I didn't answer Rocky's question ahead of time. He says,
well, that's so random.
I run street suspension on the track because I don't have money to swap between the two. But maybe if Annex develops for the RX-8, smiley face.
Man, shots fired. It's Schulte.
Mr. John JSP Fab. Not really a question, but more of a statement that I didn't really think about. Another factor rarely considered is wheel and tire size. A 30 ratio sidewall tire has much less compromise and rebound over a bump than a 60 series. If you plan to use this sidewall tire, you need to dampen the car differently than a car using flexible sidewalls. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, it's totally true. When you're trying to damp a system on a vehicle, the two major things you look for are the how much you need to damp that sprung mass, or like the weight of the vehicle, and also the unsprung mass, the weight of the shock, the brakes and the wheels and things like that. And then the other thing is you also have to consider the spring rate of the tires themselves. So a lower profile tire like a 30 series is going to have a much higher natural frequency than a balloon tire, for example. And so it's when you start tuning for that, you're kind of at that pointy, part of the tuning curve where it's not going to be as noticeable as if you're damping for the vehicle, as much as you are for the tires. But it is something to consider when you're looking at compression damping. I think the way I see it also is that I feel like it has more of an impact on your spring rate choices as well, because if you have a balloon tire that doesn't grip as well as a low profile sticky tire, that low profile tire that has more adhesion is going to be able to handle a higher spring rate and a stiffer shock than a tire with a higher sidewall that has more squirm. Because I think for many things automotive related, it's all about balance. And if you can get a spring and shock package that matches with the characteristics of the tire, that's going to give you the best overall results, because the car will be more predictable and it'll build more grip for the given setup that you have.
I have something to say about running track suspension on the street. I think one thing we commonly don't think about is that the chassis itself acting as part of the suspension. Like one thing we found out actually by surprise was that the Performance Pack BRZ actually had more chassis rigidity than a normal BRZ FRS.
Yeah, it's true. In part of the selection process when we're trying to figure out spring rates for a car is also what can the chassis actually cope with and what feels best. Maybe because the two of us know from experience all too well that if we put a really stiff suspension on a very old car, you can really feel that, and you can feel that the chassis itself has its own spring rate that needs to be considered when you're building a suspension package. So and you can really notice this. So the later BRZs with the performance package, they seem to have more bracing in the back, and the spring rate choices that we have for that car are slightly different than they would be for a more conventional car that has just a little bit less bracing.
One thing that ties into that we also try to do is when potential customers or existing customers try to determine is Fast Road or CSP the correct product for them, we try to ask them, like, realistically, what are you going to use this car for? Mm-hmm. Because there's comfort compromises, and then one biggest thing is about, for me personally, dealing with a lot of vintage vehicles is chassis longevity. Mm-hmm. Whereas like if you use a lot of harsh like Heim joints, heavy spring rates, that's hard on the chassis itself, at a certain point you might actually like rip chassis mounting points out, or the life of the chassis is like significantly shortened because you're daily driving on all these like zero slop, zero compromise items, right?
Yeah. And do I have time to talk a little more about Heim joints?
Yeah.
So going back to Victoria's question about street suspension versus track suspension, in that same vein, like a big part of a track-oriented setup is going to be focusing on less slop. The whole system should have less slop. The chassis should be stiffer because you have a roll cage. The tires are stiffer because they have stronger sidewalls, and as a consequence, you need the suspension to be able to react quicker to that kind of environment that it's being tasked to work in. So Heim joints make a lot of sense on a track car where you've got all these stiff inputs that are going into the chassis. And so so a lot of times the track suspension will have a Heim joint on the top of the top hat. And you can feel this because the shock will actually react a little bit quicker than it would if you just have a bushing. So if you're competing at that level, you do want to have these strong contact points where you're interfacing the suspension with the rest of the chassis. But like Ezekiel said, like there's consequences, right? You can imagine like if you're smacking into berms or hitting obstacles on track and your whole system doesn't have any give, it's got to go somewhere, you know? So it's basically all that force is going to go to the weakest point. And sometimes that can mean some part of the chassis tearing or ripping, where if you had a more compliant system with bushings and more give to the whole system, it can kind of absorb those really sharp impacts. So, going back to the question of using a track suspension on a street-driven car, if you care about chassis longevity, that is definitely something to consider, is to not push it to that ragged edge if you're going to be using the car all the time like that.
We are at our 7-minute mark. So for the 18 viewers that are viewing the live, we are talking about suspension tuning, street versus track car. In this 8 minutes, make sure to ask a question or else they're never going to get answered again. Never again. Rolt831 says, you just answered my question about how valving and springs relate to the tire compound and sidewall. I'm glad we could answer your question. Now shoot us a DM so we can get you set up on some Annex. Let us know what chassis you have too. Next week, we should have a video out on Jeff Wolfson's EG Civic on some prototype CSP. Why don't we talk a little bit about developing CSP for Jeff's EG Civic while we wait for some more questions. Oh, Rolt says S13. Perfect. We have a great nice. S13 setup for you. So instead of talking about Jeff, why don't we talk about your S13 setup?
Yeah, if you have any questions about the S13 in particular.
We actually have 13, 14, and 15 all developed independently of each other. And then one thing that was exciting for us and why it's important for a company to actually have a vehicle here to really physically do R&D on is that, you know, for a lot of people in the building who are familiar with S chassis, they all thought like that was like the old wives' tale. 13 and 14 suspension are the same.
Yeah, it's the same, right? They usually have the same spring rate too when you buy them.
Yeah, but we found out it was really different.
Yeah. It's pretty shocking. I'm in that category too, where I thought the cars are very similar, other than just being a little bit, the S14 being a little bit heavier and a little bit wider. But it turns out the geometries are very different, and they have very different motion ratios. And because of that, they need different spring rates and damping curves. So we're pretty happy that we were able to dig into those platforms to that level and be able to offer our customers, truly tailored suspensions for either the 13 or the 14 or the 15.
I completely forgot. And thank you, Victoria, for reminding us. I'm excited to see what's going on in the future for you guys. Cough, Subaru. Cough, lol. Yes, I completely forgot. We went to visit our local Subaru shop in San Jose, California, PM Auto Works. So we very soon plan to collab with some Subaru experts in the Bay Area to both as a Bay Area collaboration, and then also we can impart our own expertise on each other, right? There's a lot of nuances that you don't know unless you've been in the chassis for a long time. And then by that same token, there's a lot of nuances in suspension that, as your average layperson just hoping that you buy a coilover that suits you, there's a lot that's still like a dark art or a mystery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in particular, we want to learn more about Subarus in the racing field. So if you or your friends are competing in time attack or road racing with basically any Subaru platform, we'd love to hear from you, because we'd like to get more experience into that genre of cars.
3.5 minute call, you guys. Better get your questions answered fast. Rote also says it's like the AP1 and AP2 S2K. Do you think that's true? AP1, AP2 versus S13, S14? They did some...
Not quite.
Yeah, I don't think so either, because I know they did chassis bracing for that thing, and then like some minor differences so that it wouldn't oversteer as much. But
Yeah, so like, he brings a good point that the suspension is different, but in a different way than what we were talking about with the S13 and S14. To really quickly, I think the main things that they did on the AP2 changes was fixing some of the crazy bump steer that would happen on the rear of the car. So it doesn't affect the dampers directly from the math, but there may be some subjective changes on the dampers that or spring rates that one would do because of the way the car handles tow. So it's similar but different, I think.
WNBA, wannabe STI says, hoping to do on-grid shootout soon.
Awesome.
I don't know what on-grid shootout is, so Victoria, if you could let us know. Yeah, and if you guys have questions, we still have 15 people watching the live. Make sure to get your questions asked in the next. This is our 2-minute call. The suspension setup I have right now is slowly getting tired, and I may need new suspension next year-ish. So Victoria has a V8 chassis Subaru, which we are very excited for.
Yeah, we are.
Why are we excited for the V8 chassis Subaru, Grant?
Because it's like every new application that we do, it's a new challenge, right? And we've done development on that car in the past, but we're happy with our product that we have now. But we've also learned a lot since we first did those cars. So we'd love to take a revisit on that and see how we can apply what we learned in racing and with other applications to these all-wheel drive platforms. So yeah, I'm really excited for it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating doing chassis-specific R&D and having the cars here, because even though you could say like all-wheel drive versus all-wheel drive, that's not necessarily true. Like Audi, where they shove the engine and trans all the way forward, so it's front-heavy car, or Evo, where it's actually a transverse, right?
Yeah.
Whereas Subaru is probably more weight balanced because it's a longitudinal, it's just like a traditional rear drive setup. So even like all-wheel drive versus all-wheel drive, it's not really that comparable. So that's why it's important to do like per chassis application, right? Let's see. Rocky says, anyone down to do a redwood after this?
Oh, man.
I probably shouldn't have said that on the live. I don't know what that is.
I'll tell you afterwards.
Okay. Rocky, you can't be doing this on the live, man. We're trying to answer suspension questions. And on that bombshell, you know what? I'm so upset, and we only have 30 seconds left of the live. That's it, Rocky.
First and last time on live stream.
Yeah,
Rocky.
We're gonna kick you off the live, and we're going to end the Annex live right now.
All right, thank you guys for joining. It was a blast.
Thank you guys again. This will be on YouTube and audio only podcast on Monday. Make sure, if you'd like your questions answered, to ask them ahead of time in our Instagram story. And thank you for everyone who joined us. Soul Research gives us a thumbs up. Rocky says, LOL. That's not LOL, Rocky. That's not LOL. Rolt says, thanks. Thank you, Rolt.
Thank you for joining.
Rolt, send us a DM. We'll get you some solid S13 setup on Annex. Bye, Victoria. Thank you again. And Eduardo, you just joined us, and we already answered your question, but it's a good thing. This will be on YouTube on Monday. All right. Thanks again, you guys.
Thank you guys.